Mom and Dad. I've been at a sleepaway camp for almost 3 weeks. And I'm getting very scared.
Series of crimes in America.
I am going to eat your soul.
Thought you only murdered boys.
I go both ways.
Physical strength, cautious, precise. That means never impulsive. He'll never stop.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
Hello, I'm Emily Mahler, and I'm a part of your Queer Studies 304 class. I'm here to virtually introduce you to my group and I's final project. Me and your fellow peers have been working on this project for months, and we are excited to unveil our final outcome. Our project, entitled Queer Horror On and Off Screen, examines the decades, events, and movies from the time span between the 1930s to today. Individually, we all picked a decade to study. We narrowed down the wide range of movies released in these times to only be exclusive to ones in the horror genre. As a group, we decided on this because the horror genre is built on queer ideals. No matter if it's a queer identifying character or the way the film has been created, it is easy to connect the dots between how queer individuals are portrayed in horror films and the way society during a particular time treated queer individuals. I just have one question to ask you and we'll get started. What's your favorite scary movie? The 1930s were known for the Great Depression, Dust Bowl storms, and when Germany invaded Poland. However, Hollywood had a shining light in the Depression. The 1930s were known as the Golden Age. Certain landmark movies made their premieres, in particular, The Wizard of Oz. Also, famous directors like Frank Capra made their mark on Tinseltown. It is clear that the movie industry was trying to make sure the population were enchanted and charmed out of their normal routines. Yet, the studios were also trying to please politicians and conservatives. From 1934 to 1968, American films were confined to the realm of wholesome entertainment. The butter and egg men didn't like the liberal elements of Hollywood studio films and wanted them to reflect the morals of the community at large. William H. Haze, president of the Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors of America, created a set of censorship guidelines for future pictures. The morality guide of filmmakers was entitled the Motion Picture Production Code, or better known as the Haze Code, which was created in 1930. The guide of don'ts and be carefuls was far-reaching, from cutting out intense violence to speaking the name of God. Since the majority of films were sent through the censorship process, many Hollywood moguls and movie studios decided to voluntarily censor films themselves. The code was especially hard on films that featured gay actors and themes, rooting them out entirely. Movie audiences can see the clear differences between pre-coded films and coded films in that regard, especially in Universal Monsters films, like The Dark Old House from 1932 and The Creature from the Black Lagoon from 1954. There was a lurking presence of queerness and homosexuality in these films. This is something Haze, the Motion Picture Association of America, and the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America didn't want to see, ranging from sexually overt actions between same-sex individuals to underlying themes. Haze thought about sexual themes, especially homosexual themes, were reflective of the times. In the 1930s, the queer community was still mostly in hiding. The queer community would go out at night and meet people like themselves. However, in the 1930s, many heterosexual individuals decided to see what these clubs and events were like. As stated by the History Channel website, many ordinary heterosexual men and women were going to venues that featured queer entertainment. Nevertheless, when it came to events in the daytime, anti-homosexuality was at the main forefront at many politicians' minds, which pushed back the gay culture and representation. The queer community was not accepted or in the daytime when the children were awake. The community was only used as a form of adult entertainment during the night. This philosophy was used throughout the Haze Code era and eventually stopped when the Haze Code was cut in 1968, a year before the Stonewall riots. A Universal Monsters fan favorite, Dracula, has a series of spin-off movies, one of those films grabbing the attention of the government and conservatives. Dracula's Daughter from 1936 challenged the Haze Code from promotion to release. The film, produced by Universal Pictures and directed by Lambert Hillier, tells the story of Dracula's daughter, Countess Marza Zalicki. The Countess, just like her father, is a vampire. In the beginning of the film, she is trying to find a way to undo her vampirism. When she realizes that her plan won't work, she needs to keep herself alive with the blood of men and women. Her bloodlust finds the attention of a town and her father's old friend. She needs to fight for her life while killing and sometimes saving others. Several of the movie's taglines were deemed too queer or too lesbian. These taglines read out, "She gives you that weird feeling," and "Save the women of London from Dracula's daughter." The taglines brought audiences to the theater wanting a clarification. The audience did get an explanation. The film's queerness didn't just stop at the taglines. In Vito Risso's book, The Celluloid Closet, the author describes the homosexual undertones and explicit scenes. Russo explains the scenes with Countess Felicia and Lily have desire written all over it. In the particular scene that Russo describes as highly homosexual, Lily is about to undress as Zalicki is about to take a bite out of her flesh. There is desire and eroticism in her eyes when she looks at Lily. Another scene with Count Felicia is described as the longest kiss never filmed. This is with Zalicki and another female character. Although many other reviewers agreed with Russo's opinion, they thought the film was oversexed and inappropriate. Besides the reviewers' opinions, Dracula's Daughter's representation of queerness and homosexuality were often seen as negative. This created a stigma around lesbians. Universal Pictures were telling their audiences that lesbians and queer individuals are either blood-hungry and or soulless. Even if they didn't know what they were implying, it hurt people on screen. Countess Zalicki's personality and actions created a trope that we see returning in many horror films, even to this day.
1960s, the American population went through some radical changes. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his iconic I Have a Dream speech. In 1968, the first Apollo mission was launched by NASA. The political and economic landscapes were growing vastly, and Hollywood was following suit. In 1964, Sidney Poitier became the first person of color to win the Academy Award for Best Actor for his role in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. First episodes of popular cultural phenomenon Sesame Street, Doctor Who, and Star Trek aired. However, the Motion Picture Production Code, also known as the Haze Code, was still in effect until 1968. The Haze Code caused many directors and screenwriters to tame down their ideas to be morally right and clean. Yet, with the knowledge that the Haze Codes were in the process of being replaced for the rating system, many directors tried to push the boundaries of what was accepted. Movies like The Graduate and Easy Rider came out with this in mind. These were films that would not have been made in previous decades. Even though the political landscape was widening and there were laws being put into place for minorities, individuals still were in fear for their lives. At the end of the 1960s, the Stonewall riots took place. Starting in June of 1969, the riots began after the queer community had said enough to the constant raids by police at queer bars. The gathering of the queer community was disorderly in the police department's eyes. The police raids and the subsequent protests at the Stonewall Inn made international news and sparked a gay rights liberation movement. The riots consisted of 6 days of protests and violent clashes with law enforcement. Out of the riots, the queer community gained pioneers with Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. Alfred Hitchcock's horror classic Psycho used the eventual end of the Haze Code to their advantage. The movie is well known for its depiction of sex, gender, and of course, the surprising and violent twists. These elements would have caused the film to get banned if it happened during the height of the Haze Code. Based on Robert Bloch's 1959 novel of the same name, the film follows Miriam Crane as she anxiously travels to California to meet with her boyfriend after stealing $40,000 from her boss. Stops for the night at the Bates Motel. She meets Norman Bates and her surprising demise halfway through the movie. Norman Bates, our second main character, and Crane's killer, has a form of DID. With his unique form of dissociative identity disorder, he seems to switch personality from Norman to his mother Norma. The switch seems to only happen when his mother senses danger coming Norman's way. It is revealed that Norman is committing several murders dressed and acting like his mother. When Norman is finally apprehended, the policeman explains that Norman is a crossdresser and transvestite. The psychiatrist in the movie, however, tells the policeman he is wrong. He states, "A man who dresses in women's clothing in order to achieve a sexual change or satisfaction is a transvestite." But in Norman's case, he was simply doing everything possible to keep alive the illusion of his mother being alive. To the success of Psycho, Norman Bates' characteristics inspired many on-screen serial killers for generations to come. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise has characters that bend gender stereotypes in clothing similar to Norman. The character of Leatherface is dressed like a woman when they are committing their violent murders. All the films were inspired by the real-life serial killer Ed Gein, who used his female victim's skin as clothing and furniture. However, the blog Morbidly Beautiful, run by M. Payne, talks about how the serial killer and his inspired fictional killers are not actually transgender individuals. In the article Transphobia in Horror, Part 1. Leatherface, Norman Bates, and their inspiration, Ed Gein, never officially came out as a part of the community. Nevertheless, audiences are made to believe that these characters are transgender because the male serial killers are wearing wigs and women's clothing. St. Louis University did a study about the biases that cisgender individuals think against transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. The researchers found that cisgender individuals are afraid of and consider non-cis people to be scary and a distinctive threat. This analysis connects with the reason why the fictional serial killer is named terrified the audience. The wrongful portrayal of transgender people as being harmful and mentally ill is detrimental to the transgender community. During the time of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre's release, there was an event that changed the trajectory of the gay rights movement. Harvey Milk, who was the first openly gay elected official in the history of California, was shot and killed in a double murder in the San Francisco City Hall. The murders of Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone were not considered hate crimes. Before his death, Milk sponsored many bills that banned discrimination based on sexual orientation. Outside of office, Milk's Castro camera store was used as a center for people to meet and promote gay civic engagement. After his death, he was considered an icon and symbolic figure of the queer community and the history of San Francisco. When the murders were announced, there was public outcry, not only in San Francisco, but all over America. Artist Gilbert Baker created the pride flag as we know it today. Milk urged Baker to create the flag as a symbol of pride, and Baker did it in honor of Milk's life. Baker wanted everyone in the gay community to be as honest and open as Milk, and not be scared. A year after Milk's murder, the first national march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights took place. Over 75,000 queer individuals walked to demand for equal civil rights. The death of Harvey Milk, the creation of the pride flag, and the first national march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights not only grabbed public interest, but the attention of medical boards as well. The American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality as a diagnosis in 1973. According to the APA, before 1973, individuals were not born gay. It was an illness that formed in the brain over time. The symptoms of homosexuality included pathology, immaturity, and normal variation of heterosexuality. By removing homosexual as a diagnosis from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it made homosexuality be viewed more normal than it had been previously.
The 1980s were a pinnacle time for movies. So many films from this decade are considered cult classics and staples even today. Though, as you know, we're not here to talk about The Breakfast Club or Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I'll be discussing the 1983 film Sleepaway Camp and 1987's The Lost Boys, and what events at the time could have influenced them. As I'm sure we're all aware, the 80s were the peak of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the United States, starting with known cases of the virus being confirmed in the country as early as June of 1981. By the end of that first year, 337 cases had been reported, and 130 of them ended in death. The Reagan administration is to this day heavily criticized for its lack of care or action to stop the AIDS epidemic. It took Ronald Reagan 4 years after the start of the epidemic to publicly mention it for the first time on September 17, 1985. By the end of that year, over 15,000 people had been infected and over 12,000 had died at the hands of the virus, with an 89% increase in cases from 1984 to 1985. On top of that, it took another 2 years for Reagan to make his first official public speech on AIDS in May of 1987, and another month for him to sign an executive order creating the Presidential Commission on AIDS on June 24th, 6 years after the start of the epidemic. When the crisis was still relatively small in the public eye, Reagan's press secretary, Larry Speakes, held a press conference in 1982 when approximately 1,000 people had already died due to the virus. Journalist Lester Kinsolving asked Speakes if the president had any reaction to the Atlanta Center for Disease Control announcing AIDS as an epidemic with over 600 cases. Speaks replied, quote, "AIDS? I haven't got anything on it." When pressed further by Consolving, stating that a third of the people getting it had died and referred to it as the gay plague, which was the slang term for the virus at that point, the other members of the press pool and Speaks laughed and made a joke about Consolving having it. Later, in 1984, when over 4,200 people had died, Speaks and Consolving met again with more important questions from the journalist and more disturbing jokes and laughter from the press secretary and members of the press. In this case, when Consolving started his question trying to ask if the president will take steps to protect people from the spread of the virus, Speaks interrupts him, and the press pool laughs and says, quote, "This is going to be an AIDS question," in a joking tone, before Consolving had even gotten a full sentence out. When asked if the president was concerned about the topic, Speaks replied that he hadn't heard him express concern, and truthfully hadn't asked him about it. When further pressed by Consolving, who has clear frustration in his voice, asking if he would ask Reagan about it, Speaks replies, between laughs, quote, "It's hard work. I don't get paid enough." It's clear that the Reagan administration couldn't have cared less if a few queers were killed by a wholly preventable virus. Protest groups such as the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, aka ACT UP, turned to somewhat extreme measures of protest, but it worked. They knew they needed to turn their anger into action in places they couldn't be ignored. They are one of the biggest reasons drugs like AZT became available, funding was given, and policy was put in place to help people stop the death toll from rising so rapidly. It was a major struggle for activists to get people to believe and fight against the idea that the gays deserve this disease because they live against God, which we can see in the first film, Sleepaway Camp. There will be spoilers ahead, because there's no way to talk about this without revealing the shocking twist ending to you. We open with a playful scene of a man named John, his partner Lenny, and John's two kids, Peter and Angela, on a small boat in a lake. The kids play a prank on their father where they push him off and flip the boat. As they attempt to swim to shore, they are struck by a speedboat, which kills John and one of the children, who we are made to believe was Peter. We jump forward 8 years, and Angela is living with her Aunt Martha and her son, Ricky. Aunt Martha sends both children off to camp for the summer. As soon as the shy Angela arrives to the camp, the bullying and harassment starts. After a string of freak accidents and suspicious and horrific deaths occur at the camp, the audience is led to believe the killer is Ricky, defending Angela and getting revenge on those who have tormented her. In the final scene, two counselors who have tried to help Angela throughout the whole film find her sitting on the beach, stroking another boy's hair, as he looks to be resting his head on her lap. A flashback starts, and we see that the Angela we see throughout the film is not who we thought she was. The real Angela died in the boat accident. When Aunt Martha took custody of the surviving Peter, she decided to raise Peter as Angela, reasoning that she already had a son and always wanted a little girl. Back in the present, Angela jumps up as the severed head she was stroking falls to the ground, and she is seen naked, covered in blood, and holding a knife. This is where we get the infamous line, "How can it be? My God, she's a boy," as Angela's male genitalia is shown in full view. At the time of release, this film was everything a slasher movie could be. It perfectly captured the campiness that ran rampant at the time. Despite this, it had mixed reviews. One review in the Chula Vista Star News said the film was a, quote, "tasteless picture about mysterious murders at a summer youth camp that obscenely blends beheadings, stabbings, pubescent impulses, homosexuality, and transvestism with a cast of junior high school actors." Conversely, the news press called it a shockingly good slasher film. This time there are some truly creative killings and interesting plot twists, comparing it to a similar film at the time, Friday the 13th. The film landed as a cult classic for many people. The film definitely fits all of the tropes of the classic 80s summer camp slasher that has become so iconic. Even Ryan Murphy had to get in on it with his most recent season of American Horror Story, 1984. Now on to the juicy stuff. Is this film homophobic and transphobic? Yes, 100%. It perpetuates the idea that people deserve to be punished for being gay, as seen with the death of John at the beginning, and it brandishes the belief that all trans women are just dangerous men in a disguise. These are tropes we've seen in countless films at this point. It wasn't new then, and it's definitely not new now. According to a poll by GLAAD, only 16% of Americans personally know someone who is trans, so the media truly is a majority of what people only looks into the queer spectrum, away from being the fact that Angela has a penis, and shift it to recognizing the trauma this child has been through that led to the events of the film. In another cult classic 80s horror film, The Lost Boys, it's chocked full of queer coding and heavy symbolism for questioning one's sexuality. This is one of my favorite movies, and I didn't even notice the queerness until starting this project, so don't feel bad if you never did either. The Lost Boys opens with brothers Michael and Sam moving into a small town called Santa Carla with their mother after their parents' divorce to live with their eccentric grandpa. They go to the boardwalk to hang out, and a beautiful woman, Star, catches Michael's eye, and he discovers she's involved with a young biker gang and their leader, David, who we later learn are all vampires. Sam, on the other hand, meets the self-proclaimed vampire hunters, Edgar and Alan Frog, who give him horror comics to teach him about the threat that they believe has infiltrated their town. In attempts to impress Star, Michael joins the gang on a motorcycle ride down the beach to get to their lair, where David initiates him into the group by having Michael drink his blood. Star warns him that it's blood, but Michael brushes her off. At home, Michael's sensitivity to sunlight and thirst for blood begins, and after Sam's dog bites Michael, Sam realizes what has happened, and when he sees Michael's reflection is semi-transparent. Sam and the Frog brothers deduce that since Michael hasn't killed anyone yet, he's only half vampire, and to reverse his condition, they have to find and kill the head vampire. Star reveals that she's also half vampire and wants to revert back too. They don't know who the head vampire is, so they all decide to try and kill all of them, only for it to be revealed that Max, the man Sam and Michael's mother has been seeing, is. When first released, the film came in at number 2 in the box office and grossed over $32 million. Critic Elaine Showalter stated that, quote, "The film brilliantly portrays vampirism as a metaphor for the kind of mythic male bonding that resists growing up, commitment, especially marriage." It is also stated that Lost Boys aided in the shift in media depictions of vampires from the old-school Dracula type to a more sexy and youthful appearance. While not being explicitly queer, all the codes we've been trained to see in this class are there. It can be argued that Michael isn't struggling with his sexuality, seeing as seemingly only joins the group to win over Star. But if he were just trying to do that, he wouldn't have gone so far and been utterly seduced by David. David repeatedly tells Michael that he's one of us now, and gets him to trust him. With the context of this being made in the 80s, and what we've discussed history-wise earlier, the scene where Michael drinks David's blood has allegory for the HIV/AIDS epidemic written all over it. On a darker side of the queer coding argument, when Sam discovers that Michael's a vampire, he threatens to basically out him to their mom, crying about his, quote, "own brother has become the thing he detests." From this point on, Sam and the Frog brothers do everything in their power to save Michael from the influence of these sexy queer vampires, implying Michael's new identity is something he needs to be saved from. Despite this less queer ending to the film, seeing an openly gay director, Joel Schumacher, hide these queer subtexts and some camp in such plain sight is really what keeps this film in my heart forever, and what solidifies its place as a cult classic. Looking at both an outwardly queer, while also being incredibly problematic by modern standards film, and a more secretly queer, in a wink-wink, nudge-nudge sort of way, film, gives us a deeper understanding into what queer film looked like in the 1980s. In a time of such political turmoil, with an administration refusing to acknowledge the deaths of queer people, these films exemplify a sort of release from that, while still tying it in for us to look back on now.
The 1990s are often thought to have been a decade filled with peace and general prosperity. There was the fall of the Soviet Union, and with it the end of the Cold War, as well as the rise of the internet, which ushered in a brand new era of media and entertainment. Generation X led the movement of alternative media, with a growing adoration for grunge, club kids, and riot girls. the film industry continued to carry the torch of alternative media through the rise of independent cinema. This led to the inception of new queer cinema, which took the industry by storm with the films of Gus Van Sant, Todd Haynes, and Greg Araki, among others. Films such as My Own Private Idaho, Velvet Goldmine, The Living End, and Paris is Burning all introduced audiences to the queer experience and were pioneering films of independent cinema. Despite the new wave of subcultures, the 1990s were still quite conservative. This post-Reaganomic period escorted in new laws and regulations that related to homosexuality and the U.S. military service. In 1993, President Bill Clinton signed a law that directed military personnel to don't ask, don't tell, don't pursue, and don't harass. Because of this, the law was commonly referred to as Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Don't Ask, Don't Tell ultimately was a compromise between those who wanted to end the long-lived ban on homosexuals entering the U.S. military and those who thought having openly gay troops would damage morale and cause complications. Although the law was meant to theoretically lift the ban, it in turn silenced homosexual members of the military by telling them that they could only serve their country as long as their sexual identity was kept quiet. Before 1993, the number of people discharged for homosexuality had been declining. However, after 1993 and the implementation of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, this number had increased. The same fear of homosexuality is undoubtedly evident within Jonathan Demme's horror thriller The Silence of the Lambs, which was released 2 years before Don't Ask, Don't Tell was enacted. The Silence of the Lambs, directed by Jonathan Demme and adapted by Ted Talley from Thomas Harris's 1988 novel of the same name, follows a young FBI trainee, Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster, as she searches for the serial killer Buffalo Bill, who is known for skinning his female victims. In order to gain a deeper understanding of the killer's psyche and motivations, Clarice seeks help from Dr. Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins, who is a highly intellectual psychiatrist and imprisoned cannibalistic serial killer. The Silence of the Lambs was only the third film in history to win Academy Awards in all 5 of the major categories: Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Director, and Best Adapted Screenplay. It was also the first and only horror film to ever receive the Oscar for Best Picture. A highly acclaimed and financially successful film, The Silence of the Lambs was widely seen across the whole world and remains a staple of recent film history. However, backlash was immediately seen upon its release. This backlash specifically came from the queer community for the film's portrayal of the bisexual and transgender Buffalo Bill, who kidnaps women to make a suit out of female skin. During her search, Clarice finds out that Bill believes he is transsexual and has assumedly been denied access to a medical transition, as Dr. Lecter tells her. Clarice eventually tracks down and kills Buffalo, for which she earns praise and a place within the FBI. Ultimately, The Silence of the Lambs acts as a tale about a cop defeating a criminal. It is a feminist fable about a woman who fights her way through the patriarchal structures of the U.S. government. ACT UP and Queer Nation both protested The Silence of the Lambs at the 1992 Academy Awards. They protested the film on the basis that positive representations would lead to positive treatment of queer people. Despite the rise in media visibility of transgender identities in recent years, we have seen that this increase in representation is actually linked to a rise in the violence against and policing of trans people. The Silence of the Lambs does indeed portray a negative transgender object. However, it is also a story about how one kind of queer subject gains acceptance from the state in exchange for sacrificing another. Starling is the ambitious blue-collar lesbian feminist heroine who eradicates the transgender monster. The film aids us in understanding how depictions of transgender hysteria went against the normalcy of the culturally produced gay and lesbian identities within the late 20th century. During the 1990s, queer politics increasingly expected outness from these gay and lesbian identities, including Jodie Foster, who were under pressure to present themselves as delineative. Silence of the Lambs shows us the inner pervasion of the film's transgender figure, who represents a dark, scary image of queerness in replace of gay and lesbian identities. Today, the value of Silence of the Lambs lives within the relation between Foster's feminist icon and the interpretation of transphobia through Buffalo Bill. This relation explicitly explores which forms of queerness would ultimately be greeted into national acceptance and which would be abandoned. 5 years after Silence of the Lambs was launched into the cultural atmosphere, the Defense of Marriage Act was passed. The Defense of Marriage Act was created to do 2 things. For federal purposes, define marriages as the union between a man and a woman, and allow states to ignore same-sex marriages that were legally granted in other states. This law was passed by Congress in 1996 and then signed into law by President Bill Clinton. Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act, which gave the federal government permission not to recognize same-sex marriages, was eventually deemed unconstitutional since it went against the Constitution's promise of equal protection. Although part of the law was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court, the stigma against same-sex marriages still lives on within today's society. This demonization of same-sex couples is as present as ever in Peter Jackson's whimsical 1994 pseudo-horror film, Heavenly Creatures. Heavenly Creatures, starring Kate Winslet and Melanie Lynskey, is based on the real-life story of the 1954 Parker Home murders in Christchurch, New Zealand. Pauline Parker and Juliet Home met as adolescents and formed an adoring but often obsessive relationship. Their friendship was founded on a made-up world that they created and would escape to frequently. Due to the obsessive nature of their bond, the girls' parents feared that their relationship was becoming unnatural and queer, which led them to separate the two. Due to this tragic loss of companionship, they made a plan to murder Parker's mother, hoping that with her gone, they could be together forever. On June 22, 1954, they committed the crime and beat Parker's mother to death with a brick. Jackson offers a sympathetic attitude towards the juvenile murderers with Heavenly Creatures. The film is based on Pauline Parker's diaries and seeks to examine how such an intense friendship could result in a cold-blooded murder. The sexuality of the two girls is not explicit, however the reactions of their parents are. Pauline is taken to a psychologist who informs her parents that she is in fact homosexual. Within the context of the film, homosexuality is seen as a mental illness that can be corrected through psychological treatment. Once their parents make their intentions of separating them clear, their relationship only begins to intensify. There are surreal sequences of the girls sharing a bathtub and even sleeping together. Although this sexual experimentation seems to have only taken place within Pauline's mind. Juliet and Pauline's bond is built around a shared feeling of alienation. Both afflicted with illness, the girls create a mythical world where they are free to punish anyone who looks down on them. These nuanced facets of their connection and an intense emotional dependency is what leads the girls to commit the murder. Heavenly Creatures suggests that queerness is ambiguous and that it does not have to be defined. Since the girls commit such a violent act, one may read the film as an exploration of the dangers of queerness. Rather, Jackson's Heavenly Creatures acts as a celebratory observation of how queerness can compel one to create their own world in order to cope with the one around them.
(2000s), the start of the new millennium. In the 2000s, cinema advanced greatly as the use of CGI and effects became more popular. Building on the technological developments from the late 1990s, computers were used to create effects that would have previously been a lot more expensive. The 2000s was a time for fantasy films to thrive, such as Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. And it was the start of the superhero craze, starting with Spider-Man and Nolan's Batman series leading into the 2010s. At the start of the decade, Bill Clinton was in office. Hillary Clinton became the first lady to march in a pride parade. In 2007, Ellen became the first openly lesbian to host the Academy Awards, having come out in the late 1990s. She came out in the fourth season of her show, which was eventually canceled due to its major decrease in ratings. Her decision to come out had a profound impact on the way Hollywood viewed the LGBTQ community. According to a 2015 poll, DeGeneres did more to influence Americans' attitudes about gay rights than any other celebrity or public figure had done before. Before Ellen, no primetime TV character had ever come out. Although her show was canceled, it led to many other LGBT characters and shows on screen, such as Queer as Folk, The L Word, and Modern Family. In 2005, Brokeback Mountain was released, and it got a lot of critical acclaim, including 9 Oscar nominations, something no queer film had done before. While the recognition of this film did advance queer cinema greatly, it didn't make Hollywood stop being homophobic and creating the same harmful stereotypes of queer characters in films, more specifically, within the horror genre. While queer horror directors and fans have helped shape horror films, their work has also created toxic stereotypes of LGBT characters and making them into villains. Horror reflects our societal fears, and most of our society has been afraid of gayness and the supposed threat it has on heteronormative relationships and families. One of these tropes is the psycho lesbian who becomes so obsessed with another woman that it drives her to kill. An example of this is Alexandre Aja's slasher horror film High Tension. It's set in the French countryside as Marie tries to rescue her best friend Alex from a psychotic killer. However, at the end of the film, it's revealed that Alex has been the killer and kidnapper all along. Although High Tension is a great example of French nihilistic horror, it still relies upon harmful queer tropes to create its villains. In his film, Aja is still depicting societal fears about the LGBT community and the threats that they may pose to our current society. This is just one of the many harmful queer stereotypes found in mainstream horror films. These tropes make the LGBTQ community seem deviant, evil, and scary to the rest of the world. The way to improve this isn't to take queer characters out of horror films, but to not make the villains queer, or to justify the villains' actions due to their queerness. The 2004 horror blockbuster film Seed of Chucky was almost rejected by Universal Studios. Seed of Chucky was a direct follow-up to the 1998 Bride of Chucky, which is where the franchise started to shift into more of a horror comedy series. Many fans of the series were quick to dismiss Seed of Chucky because of its unapologetically queer attitude and having a transgender child character. Don Mancini, who is the creator and director for the franchise, said studio executives gave him harsh criticisms on his script. He said the decision to make the switch to a more comedic route was intentional, as his franchise was starting to lose its ability to terrify people over time, because the killers had become predictable. He said there needed to be something different to keep the franchise alive. Mancini's script was originally passed down with some very specific notes from the studio. It was too gay. Mancini, who is an openly gay man himself, tried to use his background and voice to make the franchise accessible and relatable for his LGBTQ fans. Seed of Chucky ended up being distributed by Rogue Pictures and Universal, which eventually picked up the Child Play franchise. In the later part of the 2000s, film adaptations of young adult novels began to rise. The most popular was the Twilight series, making people obsessed with vampires. Vampires, magic, mystery, the greater unknown has always been in Hollywood films. The Swedish film Let the Right One In, directed by Thomas Alvarez, based on the 2004 novel of the same name, takes that idea of the familiar vampire lore and reinvents it for the modern audience. It does a brilliant job at reinventing a very overused genre by focusing on the role that identity plays and turning into a vampire, stripping away one's humanity. Unlike other books and films on vampires, Let the Right One In never mentions crucifix, stakes, or garlic. The film takes place in Blackburb, a suburb of Stockholm, during the early part of the 1980s, and the story is a familiar one for anyone who was bullied in school. 12-year-old Oscar is the protagonist getting bullied. Oscar lives in a world that is cold, both physically and emotionally. Identity is what helps shape the film and novel. As Oscar searches to find his identity, he meets Ellie, a vampire. Ellie is very pale, skinny, and androgynous looking, leading Oscar to believe that Ellie is a young girl, but it's later revealed that he is a boy. The antisocial nature of Oscar's character aligns with many representations of queer youth. Ellie and Oscar's relationship is so pure and beautiful that we almost forget the film is about vampires. This story is about two isolated people in an isolated world who find comfort within each other. Although the film is a film about vampires, it's also a film about innocence, childhood, growing up, being isolated, which a lot of queer youth can relate to, and lastly, the importance of discovering and accepting our own identities. You don't like vampires? What about demons? Megan Fox as a man-eating demon, to be exact. Let me start off by saying Hollywood owes Megan Fox and Diablo Cody a huge apology. This film is a perfect example of the importance of marketing your film to the correct audience. The film was marketed towards Megan Fox fanboys who knew her from the Transformers series and completely missed out on young girls, who the film was intentionally made for.
The other part of the audience was guys who wanted to see something very specific from you.
What age group were the guys?
I mean, if I had to guess, I would say they were 18 to 24.
Okay.
The coveted, precious white male 18 to 24 demographic was there. I do not recall seeing a lot of girls there.
Diablo Cody's satirical 2009 film about a teenage demon girl who eats men didn't do too well in theaters. Although the film is about Jennifer becoming a demon, it also explores the intense relationship between Jennifer and her best friend Needy. There's a kiss shared between Jennifer and Needy, played by Amanda Seyfried, that has become a controversial topic. When first watching the film, it may seem like a scene only used to turn on Megan Fox's horny male teenage audience to watch the film, when in reality, Cody wrote it as an exploration of female sexuality and Needy and Jennifer's relationship. Jennifer's Body is a comedy more than a horror film that disrupts and mocks the Hollywood tropes of female-led horror films. Megan Fox herself has said this is her favorite film she has done throughout her whole career. Despite being a commercial failure in its initial release, it's gained a new audience of younger queer people, especially queer and bisexual girls, who have gained a love and appreciation for the film. Underneath its satirical rating and horror genre, it's a film exploring the intense friendship, sexuality, and coming of age of two teenage girls, something we normally don't see in Hollywood films.
At the start of the 2010s, President Barack Obama was just 11 months into his presidency. The United States started recovering from the Great Recession, and the start of the Marvel Cinematic Universe consisted of just Iron Man and Edward Norton's version of the Hulk. Not only that, but smartphones weren't popular yet. In Hollywood, the 2010s were characterized as a decade of reboot. However, it really was a decade of boldness and stunning originality. It showed cinema was still alive and well, especially for the horror genre. It has been defined as the new golden age that featured many talented artists like Jordan Peele, Ari Aster, Jennifer Kent, and many more. Stephen King made his illustrious return with the reboot of It and the sequel of The Shining, Dr. Sleep. The landscape has been flooded with so many original horror movies that it's hard to keep up. Meanwhile, politically, the 2010s have been filled with key milestones for LGBTQ rights. Over the past 10 years, the United States saw the nationwide legalization of same-sex marriage when the United States Supreme Court declared the fundamental rights to marriage is guaranteed to same-sex couples. June 26, 2015 changed many lives and futures all over the country for queer individuals. On September 20th, 2011, the previous mentioned Don't Ask, Don't Tell law was expired with no hope of reestablishment. The legislative branch of the government repealed the law before it was expired. This made sure queer individuals wouldn't be outed or live in fear of being who they are in their jobs while serving the country. Nicholas Winding Refn's 2016 film The Neon Demon follows Jessie, an underage aspiring model, as she moves to Los Angeles. A group of individuals try to connect to Jessie and find out about her life. Jessie doesn't know this, but the group will try to use her youth. She ends up having crazy dreams and doesn't understand why. The people around her in Los Angeles use her and make her believe in herself. The power she holds gets stronger and stronger, and people want to physically feed off the energy. The film's reviews were tossed in a mixed bag. It was booed by reviewers at the Cannes Film Festival, and later it received a standing ovation. Even though the reviewers believed the Neon Demon was grotesque, Tasha Rochelle Taylor's article, titled "The Neon Demon is a Queer Horror Film with a True Lesbian Villain," believes the reviews were positive. In the article, the author talks about how lesbianism and queerness during the film are built up. Ruby's character isn't just a lesbian. Trigger warning, she's a necrophile, cannibal, and a sexual predator. Jessie is underage and Ruby tries to seduce her. Ruby becomes obsessed with Jessie, that she sexually assaults her, and as Jessie fights back, she passes away, resulting in Ruby raping a corpse. After she rapes Jessie, Ruby decides to eat Jessie's body. This film tells the audience queer women are psychopaths and evil. It shows that they will go to great and violent lengths to acquire their obsession. Unfortunately, the decade saw tragedies and setbacks that harm what we have been fighting for years, like the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. On June 12, 2016, a gunman murdered 49 people. In NPR's article titled 3 Hours in Orlando, Piecing Together an Attack and Its Aftermath explained the 3 hours of horror. It has many segments, including ones regarding the shooter and the attack minute by minute. Yet, one that stands out is about the visuals and memories of the victims. It was not only in Orlando and the queer community that mourned, but America and the world that publicly outcried to demand change for gun laws and open homophobia. Everyone in the generation before us remembers where they were when 9/11 happened. Everyone who is queer will remember the Pulse nightclub shooting. The Pulse Orlando nightclub shooting was the deadliest mass shooting in the United States history for years. However, that is a whole other topic. One of the major events of the latter part of the 2010s was the two-part film adaptation of Stephen King's It. The first part was all about making a lifelong group of friends, coming of age, and defeating an evil clown. However, in the final part released in 2019, these details are heightened and now include the personal growth of adults. After being 20 years apart from his group of friends, Richie realizes he is in love with his best friend Eddie. He hides his feeling towards Eddie, and when he's ready to come out, it's too late. The film explores with a couple of scenes how he realizes he's gay, and how hard it is to come out. One includes Pennywise threatening to reveal his secret to everyone in town. The other heartbreaking scene takes place when the town bullies use homophobic slurs and verbally abuse Richie for having a good time with a boy his age. Director Andy Muschietti said, "When we see the traumatic events that started the whole suppression, we see Richie being himself and beginning to realize who he is, and immediately he's pointed out and humiliated." Now this is something that we really didn't see in the first installment. Both actors who play Richie, young and old, play the hardships of keeping such a personal and suppressing secret for so long. One major element that was brought into the adaptation from the original book is the beginning of the film, at the Dairy Carnival, where a homophobic hate crime becomes deadly. Adrian Mellon and his boyfriend are being open with their affection for each other, and they piss off a group of homophobic men. A fight ensues and Mellon gets thrown over the Dairy Bridge. There isn't time to save him, and we see Mellon beaten by Pennywise. The director included this scene in the film because he wanted to comment on hate crimes such as the Orlando shooting. In King's case, the carnival was actually based on a hate crime that happened in a small town like Derry. The victim's name was Charlie Howard. It is definitely hard to watch and read. Many audience members believe the scene was too harsh and could have been toned down. Jeffrey Bloomer from Slate magazine said the scene was gay-bashing and was only a cheap thrill. The queer elements of the film are talked about in the Time magazine article titled, "How It Chapter 2 Handles the LGBTQ Themes of Stephen King's Novel." The director explains, "I think King was doing a social commentary on how effed up America was at the time. And when it came to adapting it, the theme was still very present and important for me, the dark side of the human equation," he says. He follows by saying leaving bigotry and homophobia and that kind of violence out would not only not be accurate to the times that we're living in, it would be omitting something that is still happening to this day and is horrible. In the last couple of years of the 2010s, the world saw many countries make same-sex marriage and joint adoption legal. In America, it is now legal for transgender individuals to join parts of the military. Northern Ireland even lifted its lifetime ban of gay men donating blood. Nonetheless, many countries, including America, have had homophobia run rapid. As soon as Trump was elected into office, the White House website took down mentions of the queer community and their rights. A couple months later, Trump tried to stop the enlistment of transgender individuals in the military and withdraw the guidelines for transgender students in public schools. For the case of filmmakers taking back negative tropes against the queer community, Jan Gonzalez's Knife Plus Heart does exactly that. This horror film is set in Paris' 1970s porn scene. The main character, Anne, is a pornography producer whose main actors keep dying in horrific ways. Anne doesn't see the connection between the death until her alcohol-induced nightmares get darker and darker. Once this happens, she decides to investigate the murders herself, seeing the police don't care about the case because the victims are gay porn stars. Gonzalez's film is a form of gallows, a French mystery fiction that contains elements like psychological horror, sexploitation, and slasher. The film has many positive reviews. Vogue magazine even gave the film 2 thumbs up. One of the most common elements of gallows is the slasher, who is often masked, is finally revealed in the final act. Knife plus Heart doesn't stray from this classic element, but they put their own take on it. The masked killer is revealed to be Guy Favre, a young man who was burned and murdered by the hands of his father after finding out he was gay. Favre believes gay porn made him homosexual, so he takes it upon himself, when he is revived by a crow, to kill everyone in the gay porn industry. In the final act set in the porn theater, Anne and one of her actors, Nans, goes to the premiere of her newest film. Favre is also there to try to kill Anne and Nans, but he is interrupted by the audience. The audience rushes to the stage and kills Favre with his own weapon. This is something that I haven't seen before in the film. We can compare this to Dracula's daughter. In that film, Countess Zaleski is queer-coded as bisexual. She dies because there is hatred and homophobia towards her. There's no homophobia in the final scenes of the movie. It's just a group of moviegoers trying to save a man who is about to die from Favre's knife.
We hope you enjoyed our project, Queer Horror on and Off Screen. As a group, we learned that as American politics and culture begin to embrace a wider range of moral values, Hollywood followed suit. However, Hollywood sometimes isn't ready to portray the queer community in a positive light. They have caused damage to the queer community by representing its culture as a root of violent behavior. This is first shown in Dracula's daughter. Yet in other parts of the world, even though homophobia grows, the queer representation in horror films are getting more and more complex and lifelike. For example, with Anne and Louise in Knife Plus Heart, the struggle for inclusion and acceptance still continues. The industry has often led the way by creating controversial films that have challenged old morality. However, Hollywood has gone a long way to include the queer community of writers, actors, and directors in horror films and beyond. Thank you so much for viewing our project. There is one more info clip coming your way in 3, 2, 1.